Okay, so hi everyone. Sorry I cannot be there in person. It's been already interesting. And in the very short time that I have, I want to show you a few examples of how, so I didn't say I'm Yossi Yovel from Tel Aviv University, Israel. And in the few minutes that I have, I'm going to show you a few examples of how we use technology in order to decode animal communication. The first animal model, which is the one I mostly work on, is going to be a bat, or more specifically, Egyptian fruit bats. Hopefully the sound is going through. I'm going to play back this short video to you, take you into a colony with thousands of fruit bats. Okay, so you can see them already, and this is what they sound like if you enter the colony. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that. I could. This is, in one word, a cacophony, right? Thousands of individuals constantly vocalizing. And the two main questions that we would like to know, I think some of them have been already asked in the previous talk, are what are they talking about and whether they have to learn it. Okay, there are also some other questions that I can think about. So let's start with what are they saying to each other. This is what their vocalizations look like. These are spectrograms, frequency over time. And most of the vocalizations here on the right are what we would call, before the era of AI, maybe 10 years ago, we would say these are just agonistic calls. They're just fighting with each other. On the left, you can see a few other contexts. So there's mating, there are isolation calls, but most of the vocalizations, 99%, I would say, look like this. Maybe it's not surprising, right, when you live in such a crowd so tightly packed together. So in order to approach this question, to ask whether there's more information than meets the ear or the eye, we created a huge, probably one of the biggest, maybe the biggest still annotated data set of mammalian vocalizations. We recorded in total millions of vocalizations, but we annotated, we manually, and I emphasize manually annotated something like 20,000 sequences of vocalizations. When I say annotated, we identified an emitter, addressee, and context. And if you're asking yourself what happened, how did we go down from nearly 200,000 to 20,000? The answer is just we cleaned it, very, very thoroughly. So anything that was slightly debatable, we just threw out. And by the way, this data set is uploaded. People have used it. Anybody can use it. It's open and free, and all of our data is like this. So I think emitter, addressee, it's clear. But by the way, I should have said we created smaller groups, smaller colonies while doing this. This is impossible to do in a cave like I showed you. But what do I mean by context? So these are contexts that we identified with our human eyes. Okay, again, I'm emphasizing the limitations already in between the words. So this is what we call feeding. These are camera safety cameras, so the vision is not very, very visible, but if you look carefully, you'll see top left that one individual is holding a banana in its mouth and the other one is trying to get it. Okay, hopefully you can hear the sounds, and if you can, just listen to them and see if you can tell the differences. This is mating, so it's a female, so this is before mating. It's aggression before mating, the female shouting at the male. By the way, you can see everything's covered with acoustic foam, so the recordings are very, very high quality. This is just random fighting, usually about space. And bottom right, my favorite one, they're sleeping, and one of the individuals wakes a neighbor and gets shouted at. Okay, and the question was, we can identify this with our eyes. Can we use machine learning, not neural networks, even though later on we did use neural networks and we found very similar results in order to extract information. Very, very quickly, we can talk about the details if somebody interested. We're using spectral features, so capsular coefficients, when we're using Gaussian mixture models, but a slightly more complex model called the GMM UBM, which has some kind of a background model. As I said, neural networks resulted in very, very similar results, and I'll show you later on a study with neural networks. Very, very quickly, because I want to show you a few other studies. This is the confusion matrix. For those of you who don't know, we have the predicted individual or the predicted category versus the true category. If the diagonal is high, is positive, is bright, this means we're doing well. And as you can see, we can identify the emitter quite easily. We can identify the context, so those 4 contexts that I mentioned, and to some extent, we can also say who is the addressee. Okay, so whether it's a female being addressed or a male, and even to some extent above chance, so not 100%, far from 100%, but we can say whether individual A or individual B is being addressed. Later on, we also asked ourselves what's the, so that was all with a single vocalization, but as you've seen and as I said, and as you heard also, they emit, these bats usually emit sequences of vocalizations, and you see they might be slightly different from each other, each syllable or whatever you want to call these, vocalization, they're slightly different. By the way, I didn't say, but in general, these are rather non-tonal. There is some tonality, but they're mostly wideband, what we would call noisy vocalizations, which are quite difficult to work with from an acoustic point of view, a bit similar to human speech in terms of complexity. So what Yoni here did, another student in the lab, is to ask what is the function of the sequence. And he did use neural networks. He used the variational autoencoders, for those of you who know neural networks, and show that the longer the sequence, the more information, so that the more accurate we are, at least for most of the context, in predicting what is the context. So the same context that you've seen before, but when the sequence is longer, the better we are in predicting its origin. Okay, now I say we because later on I will emphasize that it's super important in my opinion to ask whether the bat is also doing this. I think it can for sure, but whether it is doing this. Okay, so this was what kind of information is there. The other question, which has been asked by somebody already regarding prairie voles, is do they learn it? So what we did is we recorded the bat pups from day 1, day 0, I should say, and until they become adults. You can see here what we call feature space. So these are acoustic features similar to the ones that Con showed, but others. And we will see how over time, so this is the adult space. This is the region in the space where the adult vocalizations reside. And if we look at the pup over time, you can see that it gradually, this is, by the way, these are days. So it takes almost a year or 2/3 of a year until it gradually reaches the adult space. Okay, now we did do an isolation experiment. I'm also not a very big keen on them, but we did it very carefully. We had the pups not completely isolated, but with their mothers. Okay, and they do not communicate with their mothers. They're under the wing. Only the mothers communicate with each other. And if we now compare, I will run this quickly. We compare 5 non-isolated pups. These are the circle ones. You see they mostly find themselves after 200 days in the adult area with 5 isolated ones. And we show that basically, even though the isolated ones are moving in the same direction, so there is an innate component to their acquisition of the vocal repertoire, but as you see, they fall short of reaching the adult region. So there seems to be also some learned component in their acquisition of communication. Okay, we've done a few other manipulations, but I do not have time, I think, to talk about them. Now, as I said, this species, some people are always disappointed when I say they're only what are they talking about? They're only fighting with each other. I'm not disappointed. I think, if this is, this is their behavior, this is where they interact socially, then it's expected that this is where their communication will evolve to. But still, I've been interested in looking into groups, into taxa, where you have more cooperative behavior. And this is how I find myself working with Arabian babblers, which are cooperative breeders. There's a pair that breeds, and another 6 to 10 individuals, usually descendants, that live together over many, many years. And they exhibit many types of cooperative. They forage together, and they do many things together. And one of the interesting things they do together is they will mob predators. And they have a very unique call when doing so. We call it a SIT, an alarm. It's a type of an alarm call, but they have very specific, predator-specific alarm calls. And actually, they will do it even for a plastic model. So there's a plastic snake placed here in the sand, and look at their behavior. On the right, they will appear. These are the babblers. You can also hear them. Now, it's very difficult to track who is calling in such an environment where you have so many callers. And this is why on the left, I see it's a bit hard to see because of the video. Hopefully you can see. We started using arrays of many, many microphones, which now allow us to see. I think the video is having difficulties when I'm talking, but hopefully you get the point. When using these arrays, we can now say very clearly who's vocalizing. Okay, the snake is somewhere here. I'll let the video finish. Okay, and now this allows us, I'm not going to show you any results, it's very, very new, but this now, a new approach will allow us to ask questions such as, are there cheaters in the group? Are there individuals who are calling louder, but not really approaching the snake, or not as close as others? Are certain individuals responding to certain specific individuals, and so on? Once again, I want to emphasize the technology, the array, which is allowing us now to decipher who is calling, which was previously impossible. Now, the last thing I want to say is that we should really look broadly. So I think it was Vint who already wrote in the chat that we should look at chemo reception and perhaps tactile communication and so on and so on. And recently we've shown, I was involved in a group that has shown that plants actually produce signals or sounds, I should say. I'm not saying this is communication yet, but we found that drying plants, or whether they're cut or dry, so whether they're under some kind of stress, emit ultrasonic around, as you can see here, around 60 kilohertz, very brief signals. These are probably results of physical phenomena that are occurring in their water vessels. This is what it sounds like. Okay, I have to be quiet because it's quite brief and quiet. Okay, so those brief clicks, and you can see them here, they're very short in time with a center frequency of around 60 kilohertz. And we show, again, using machine learning that we can identify the plant to some extent. We can say whether it's tomato, for example, tobacco. What you heard right now was a geranium, by the way. And we can also say something about the type of stress, whether it's water stress or being cut, and now we're looking at other types of stress. Now, again, I said, I don't think I'm not arguing it's communication. I don't think it evolved for communication, but perhaps it did evolve for some things. And even if not, perhaps there are animals or other organisms that are using it. So one of the questions that we're asking these days is whether some insects perhaps are eavesdropping on these clicks in order to use them. So the point is that we have to keep our minds open when looking at animal communication. So very, very brief summary. I showed you a few examples of using technology in order to, and AI, in order to try, I will not say we succeed, but try to decode animal communication. I talked about the acquisition of communication being both innate and learned. I showed you an agonistic species, or at least agonistic communication versus pro-social communication. And the last thing, I said this a few times, I want to emphasize, I think it's super important, the fact that I threw some parameters into a classifier, statistical classifier, and managed to classify them doesn't say much if I do not show that the animal really cares about these statistics. How we can do this is a whole new story. It's not easy at all. Here on the left, for example, this is a completely artificial bat vocalization that I created using a generative artificial neural network. But does it mean something to the bat, right? That's the question. I can play it to you, maybe to your ears. Here it is. Maybe it sounds bat-like to you, but the question is whether it sounds bat-like to a bat. One of the ways to address this question, and I'm not going to go into details, is to MRI these animals. What you see here on the right, it's non-invasive. We can place them in the machine. We can play sound vocalizations to them, examine the response of their brain. Together with a colleague, Oded Rechavi, who's actually a C. elegans researcher, we wrote a whole recent review trying to address these problems, like the problem that I have it's called AI and the Dr. Dolittle Challenge, like the problem I just mentioned, and also to suggest some criteria that I think will be of relevance for this meeting and the people here. That's it. Thank you very much.
Questions? Yeah, we do have time for questions.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering, because animals move all the time, the bats, when they're adults, and you showed they kind of converge to some sort of dialect, I will call it. If they move to a different region, would they need to learn the new local dialect, or would they be just universal kind of signals that they can communicate to a different region?
Do you want me to answer now or wait for other questions? Okay, I'll answer. So yeah, I said we've done several studies. In another study, we actually do exactly this. We rear pups with different dialects. We also call it dialects. And we show that the dialect did have an impact on the adult vocalization. So it did converge in the direction of the dialect. You asked about adults. It's a good question. There are a few papers out there suggesting that adults are also able to adjust their dialect, adult bats, I mean. But I think we still need more evidence. I think it's still not strong enough.
Vin, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Yossi. That was an absolutely amazing presentation.
Thank you.
I wonder, as we look at these various animals emitting signals, some of them may be multimodal. Imagine an ape sounding and pounding the chest and so on. So I wonder to what extent multimodality enters into any of your work.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things we emphasize in that AI and Dr. Doolittle paper is exactly this, that we might be missing on some of the important signals while concentrating on others. We do look at multimodality mostly in terms of other behaviors so far. So, for example, with navigation, we've looked at vision with echolocation. And, I liked your definition earlier on I think you said something like a cognitive message is being passed. And I liked it because I always say animal communication is, for me, just a small part of the puzzle. I'm interested in the animal as a whole. I study navigation. I study sociality. I'm interested in how I like to say how it makes decisions. And I think communication is essential for understanding that. Now, regarding your specific question, I would say not enough. So we now have a study on olfaction and foraging. How does it affect the decision when foraging? I've always wanted to run a study where I see the social ties forming in a group and then eliminate the olfaction temporarily, for example, and see what's the effect. We have a few anecdotal results suggesting that when you create a temporary anosmia, an individual bat will now move aside and not be part of the group. So super interesting, but I can't say anything really concise yet.
Thanks so much for trying to respond. I know this is a very complex area, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. I was noticing in the fruit bat video, you have a lot of individuals calling simultaneously, and it's really different from turn taking in humans, for example. And I was wondering if maybe the bats encode information in things like the amount of overlap, or if they're converging on similar call structures throughout the conversation, if you could call it that, or if you have any idea if they're doing something similar.
Yeah. So again, very good point, and something we've looked at a little bit. So first of all, those recordings that I've showed you were made in smaller groups. I mentioned this very, very quickly. And you see, sometimes you do see turn taking, but it's rare. Most of the time, you will not see turn taking. And again, I think when we think of bats as humans or as of our animals as humans, we have to be careful with this. So I think in a lot of cases, the interactions are local. And they are actually paying attention to a specific individual. Sometimes it's referred to as the cocktail party. But I think in other cases, definitely, like you see, these fruit bats in the cave, they do not have an alarm call. And I think they don't need it, because once I enter the cave, I'm a predator, of course, then there'll be a wave of interactions moving through the colony. And at some point, we haven't measured this, but I'm quite sure, at some point, there's just so much commotion, so much going on, that for them it's clear that a predator has entered the colony. And there's no need for an alarm call. We've also shown in another study, we called it crowd vocal learning. We showed that the pups will actually learn from the crowd and not their vocalization, and not from specific individuals. So I think it's a combination of both.
Okay, thanks, Yossi.